Okay, now I know that in my last video on Frankenstein, there was a lot of confusion that I threw around regarding the monster's color, and quite frankly, I'm still not entirely sure exactly what color Frankenstein's monster is supposed to be. That being said, something I am absolutely certain about is the fact that the Bride of Frankenstein has red hair. That is true. The hair cage wig that the actress wore is still on display in Hollywood. It is red, the Bride of Frankenstein had red hair, and if you go to Universal Studios Hollywood and interact with the costumed characters, you will see that the bride costume also has red hair. So, there you go. Hey everyone, I'm Ben, your underground conductor, and welcome to Underground Cinema. Now, a lot of people may not know this, but not only is March 8th International Women's Day, but the month of March in general also happens to be Women's History Month. So I figured, what better way to bring in Women's History Month, as well as tie into the newest Frankenstein adaptation, The Bride, than to talk about the original female horror icon, The Bride of Frankenstein. Now, The Bride of Frankenstein is quite obviously the sequel to the original Universal classic Frankenstein from 1931. This sequel was released 4 years later in 1935, and was also a sequel concept that had been toyed around with ever since the release of the original Universal classic. I mean, I covered this topic extensively at the beginning of the year when I reviewed the original Frankenstein, but it really cannot be overstated exactly how iconic that movie has become over the course of nearly a century now. And something that's almost more interesting than the legacy of that original film is the legacy of this film, its sequel. I mean, I would argue that The Bride of Frankenstein is probably one of the most iconic sequels ever made. I mean, I would put it up there with, like, The Empire Strikes Back in terms of iconography regarding a sequel versus its original. And much like The Empire Strikes Back, Bride of Frankenstein is also broadly considered to be superior to the original film, and much like the original film, which has one of the most iconic makeup designs of all time, in the form of the monster designed by Jack Pierce, and co-consulted on by the film's director James Whale, Bride of Frankenstein similarly has an almost equally iconic design. As the design of the bride herself, I would argue, has actually transcended this movie, and has become an overall staple of the iconography for the Universal monster films. Hence why, out of literally every other Universal Monster sequel, this is the only one that's ever referenced. Which is why the bride herself is the only sequel monster who's ever shown alongside the other iconic Universal monsters like Dracula, or Frankenstein's monster, or the Wolfman. And additionally, the bride is also the only female monster shown in that lineup, despite the fact that there are others that exist from this classic monster era. Of course, few people remember movies like Dracula's Daughter, and basically no one remembers She-Wolf of London. Hell, people don't even remember Werewolf of London. So in this category, The Bride of Frankenstein stands as unique in multiple ways. So, with all that in mind, you have to ask yourself, it's been over 90 years, how does this film hold up? Does it live up to its reputation? Is it really one of the best sequels of all time? It was something I was curious about, especially considering I hadn't seen this movie since I was a kid. So I busted back out the Universal Blu-ray Monster Collection, with the black and white case rather than the blue case. See? And I decided to rewatch Bride of Frankenstein with a semi-fresh set of eyes. So without any further ado, what happens in The Bride of Frankenstein? Well, to prompt even further delays, The Bride of Frankenstein actually begins with a prologue. In the prologue, we see that Mary Shelley is sitting with a few of her friends, and she is telling the story of Frankenstein. And she elaborates on the fact that what we saw at the end of the first movie, with the monster, burning in the windmill, was actually not the end of the story. Which is technically true. As I referenced in my Frankenstein video, that film is very dissimilar from the book. And not only does the original film make substantive changes from the source material, but there's also a lot of things that were just cut out, and a lot of those things are actually present in this movie, which is actually quite interesting and makes this film feel like it's a complementary pairing to the first film. Like it's a genuine continuation, which I feel like aids in the film's overall reputation. But moving on from that point, Mary Shelley brings us back to the end of the previous film, as we see the windmill burning down. And while the villagers are content believing that the monster has been destroyed, they are quickly proven wrong, as Frankenstein's monster has in fact survived, crawling from the rubble of the windmill, and moving forward to see what life still has to offer him. Meanwhile, the monster's creator, Henry Frankenstein, has been taken home to his estate, and is being comforted by his fiancée, Elizabeth. However, during his recovery, he receives an unwelcomed visitor in the form of Dr. Pretorius, a fellow scientist who has also been experimenting with the creation of life. As we see in this film, Dr. Pretorius has actually successfully created several miniature human beings that he has grown, which is quite impressive actually, both in narrative and out of narrative, as the optical effects used to create the tiny people are spectacular. Like seriously, they look really good, and there's one specific moment in particular where Dr. Pretorius lifts up one tiny person and puts him to the other side of the table. But Dr. Pretorius is frustrated because he can't get his creatures actual human size. So he wants to team up with Dr. Henry Frankenstein to actually properly unlock the secrets of life. Dr. Frankenstein refuses the partnership offer as he's convinced what Pretorius is doing is not science, but is instead black magic. And he goes on to recall what his fiancée Elizabeth has told him, that what he's doing is not in fact God's will, but is in fact temptations from the devil. Which is ironic because Pretorius has actually made a little devil as well. In any case, while all this is happening, Frankenstein's monster has been wandering around the forest, just looking for anyone to be kind to him. But he's having so much trouble finding any nice person, and upon seeing his own reflection in the water, he pats it away in disgust of his own visage. It's just so frustrating for him, as everyone he comes into contact with either runs away from him in fear, or simply greets him with violence, which he must then return in kind. At a certain point, Frankenstein's monster actually gets taken prisoner by all the villagers and thrown into a dungeon, but obviously this arrangement doesn't last too long as he breaks out and begins to terrorize the village. Retreating once again to the forest, Frankenstein is still desperate for any form of comfort, and that is when he comes across an old blind man. The old blind man is equally lonely, and not being able to see the creature's appearance, welcomes him simply as a friend that he offers warmth, comfort, food, and education to. And I'll be very frank about this. This entire sequence of the film, with Frankenstein and the old blind man, is the best part of the movie, period. It's taken straight out of the book, it's treated so earnestly, especially compared to a lot of the more comedic beats in this movie, and it's genuinely emotionally moving, as both characters are treated with a fundamental amount of sincerity and respect. And also, as a side note, something interesting that I noticed is that the relationship between the old man and Frankenstein in this movie kinda mirrors the relationship that Gwynplaine has with Dee in The Man Who Laughs. Like, obviously the relationship that Frankenstein has with the old blind man isn't romantic at all, but the underpinning meaning of the relationship, the fact that a blind individual can look past the outward ugliness of this pitiful creature and see the beautiful, lovely man underneath who deserves compassion. It's really a beautiful theme that aligns itself with the idea that love exists in the eye of the beholder, and really adds to the complexity and also the sympathy that you feel for the creature in this movie. Unfortunately, as sweet as this friendship is between the two characters, it gets broken up rather quickly, as a pair of hunters that Frankenstein had a run-in with earlier in the movie come to recognize him and immediately meet him with violence, as well as taking away his friend, the old blind man. The creature, frustrated to be left alone once again, continues to wander around until he eventually comes into a cemetery. After descending into a grave, he eventually comes to run into Dr. Pretorius, and basically becomes Pretorius's enforcer, as Pretorius goes on to use the creature as a way to force Dr. Frankenstein's hand, which is very easy to do, as Pretorius and the creature basically want the same thing. The creature wants a friend, a companion to share life with, and Pretorius wants a new challenge in creating life. And more specifically, he wants to make a woman. He's stressed that to Frankenstein earlier in the film. And it's actually quite interesting that in this movie they emphasize the point that making a woman will be a new challenge for the both of them, because that's technically true. As historically speaking, medical scientists have been completely baffled by the female anatomy and have opted to use the male anatomy as a basis for all human research. And this is still very much the case now, as when women go to the doctor, they're often misdiagnosed with different illnesses and conditions. Because in comparison to the male body, doctors actually have very little understanding of how the female body works. And the default use of the male body when conducting research has essentially just been done as a shortcut to get around studying the menstrual cycle, because apparently it's just too difficult to study a body that has its hormones change every month. And you know what? I'm not a scientist. I understand that there's a lot of different variables that you have to take into account when you're doing research, especially research into something as important as medicine. But, I don't know. I feel like it would be easier to, study the female body if you just got out of the lab every now and then and, talked to a woman. I mean, they're right there. I'm just saying, you could talk to a woman. Just putting that out there. In any case, the monster goes on to kidnap Elizabeth to force Frankenstein to help Pretorius create the female creature. And with the creation of this creature, Pretorius and Frankenstein combine their various expertise in human tissue to create the final result. And to bring this new female creature to life, they basically repeat the life sequence from the previous movie. Raising the body up, having it get electrocuted, yada yada yada. Although disappointingly, they didn't bring up the fact that in order to bring life to an inanimate body, you would have to tap in to a new form of light on the ultraviolet spectrum that Frankenstein had discovered. I mean, you don't have to repeat everything from the first movie, but some explanation on how to create life would be welcome, especially since they don't really do that in the book. At least from what I can remember. I haven't read the book since middle school, but yeah, I don't remember if they brought up how the creature was brought to life. In any case, though, the bride is born, and as she opens her eyes, Frankenstein repeats his proclamation from the previous film as he shouts, "She's alive! She's alive!" Which, that was just a little embarrassing. I'm not gonna lie about that. Repeating an iconic line from the first movie, which the filmmaker was very aware was iconic from the first movie, that's just kind of embarrassing and feels a little lazy. I don't know what else to say about that. But we then get the iconic appearance of the bride herself. With the whole beehive hair and the lightning squiggles and the pale white skin, the bandaged arms, almost like she's a mummy. And even though she doesn't speak the same way the monster learns to speak in this movie, she shares the innate curiosity that he has. As immediately when she's brought to life, she just starts jutting her head around, as she's overstimulated by everything surrounding her. Which I feel like was an interesting acting choice, especially since that's exactly how a newborn baby behaves. Like, anyone who's ever spent any time around an infant would notice that very early on in life, they'll just turn their heads everywhere whenever they see something that's interesting or different or colorful. Because the world is new to them. They don't understand everything, so everything is interesting. Of course, much like an infant, whenever you see something unnatural, you're going to get frightened. And as soon as the bride lays eyes on Frankenstein's monster, she screams. The creature tries to get closer to her, but she just completely rejects him. And recognizing that she hates him, he chooses to reject life and embrace death, which is what the entire film has been leading up to at this point, as he tells Dr. Henry Frankenstein and Elizabeth to flee as he blows up the lab, with himself, Pretorius, and the bride still trapped inside, thus ending our tragic tale of life and death, as this creature who's been thrusted into a life he did not ask for chooses to leave it on his own terms. And yeah, that's The Bride of Frankenstein. And is this movie better than its predecessor? Well, I'm not sure that it is. This was an interesting rewatch for me, because like I said, I hadn't seen this movie since I was a kid. And I remember watching it as a kid, and I liked it more than the first movie because I felt like more things happened in it. And really, the only things I remembered from this movie were the hunters being surprised that the old man was blind, Frankenstein's monster saying the name Frankenstein and surprising Dr. Frankenstein, and the bride being terrified of Frankenstein's monster. Aside from that, I basically went into this movie with fresh eyes. And going into this rewatch, while it is true that more things happen in this movie, and this film also has a better pace, there's just elements of the film that just feel kind of off and weird. Like the fact that there's a very heavy comedic tone put into play in this movie. And that's not to say that the previous Frankenstein film wasn't funny. Like, there were comedic elements to be found in the previous film, especially with Baron Frankenstein, Dr. Frankenstein's father, and just his dry, insulting wit. But this film really just kind of chooses to abandon, like, the sophistication and formalities of the previous film to embrace a more comedic tone. And I don't think it 100% works most of the time, especially since a lot of the comedy is localized to a single character, being Minnie, the housekeeper, and I just don't think she's funny. Like, she appears from the beginning of the film, immediately after the prologue, and no shade to Una O'Connor, who plays Minnie. I think she does a pretty good job, and it's very clear that she was doing what she was told to do, but I don't find her funny. I find her just very annoying. And the same thing goes for the Burgomaster in this film, played by E.E. Clive. As far as I know, no relation to Colin Clive, who plays Henry Frankenstein. The Burgomaster is also a sort of comic relief character in this film, not as intensely as Minnie, but he's also kind of annoying. And I feel like the inclusion of these characters sort of actively disrupts the tonal consistency of this film. Especially when you get to the second act and you follow the monster specifically. All of the monster stuff is just treated so earnestly. So you take that and you compare it to a more comedic first act, where you have these two comic relief characters, and then you also meet Dr. Pretorius as he's showing off his ridiculous tiny people experiments. While I like Dr. Pretorius, and I find the tiny people fascinating both narratively and technically, it just feels like a complete disconnect. Like they should be part of two separate movies. And I feel like this tonal inconsistency has a lot to do with the director James Whale, as apparently Whale didn't want to make this movie. He was kind of strong-armed into it by the LaMilles because the original Frankenstein had been just such a success. So he reluctantly came in to make this movie, but he said he would only do it on his own terms. Which kind of reminds me of like how Joe Dante didn't want to make Gremlins 2, but when he did, he made it as like a parody of Gremlins 1. It feels like there's a similar vibe here. Of course, many people would go on to say, and I feel like this is true, that James Whale wasn't one for parody. He was an ironist. And there definitely is a lot of irony to be found in this movie, particularly regarding the religious debate that's in this movie, as Whale was apparently a rationalist, and supposedly Dr. Pretorius was essentially a stand-in character for Whale. Yet, at the same time, Pretorius is very clearly the antagonist of this film, and him choosing to go against God's will goes completely against the central theme of the movie of how man shouldn't play God, which is spelled out to the viewer in the film's prologue by Mary Shelley. Of course, that's another thing I found interesting about this film, the fact that there is a prologue with Mary Shelley and a few of her friends, where she simply just tells you what the theme of Frankenstein is, and how the publishers of the book didn't understand what she was trying to say with it. And supposedly, this prologue was something that Whale wanted to include, but watching this prologue also felt like it was something that they had to include because of the censorship boards. I mean, this movie was made in 1935, a year after the Hays Code was put in place, which was essentially a grouping of regulations which dictated what could and could not be shown in movies, and what subject matters and themes could and could not be presented in movies. And was essentially just a grouping of regulations which was put in as a way to just self-govern and avoid any moral outrage which was prevalent at the time. So keeping that in the back of my mind, there was just elements of this movie, like the prologue, where I thought to myself, okay, I feel like they put this in because they felt like they had to. And I do feel like that kind of hurts the film in the long run. I mean, there's certainly elements of this film that are improved upon by the restrictions. Like, there's a line early on in the movie when Dr. Pretorius is insulting Frankenstein's religious belief, and he tells Frankenstein, this goes along with your Bible stories. and apparently the original line that Pretorius was supposed to say was fairy tales, but that line was objected upon by the censorship boards as it could potentially lead to a claim of blasphemy, so they changed it to Bible stories. But with the tone and inflection that Pretorius' actor Ernest Thesiger delivers, him saying Bible stories actually sounds more insulting than if he said fairy tales. So there's instances like that that improve the film. But there's other instances where it feels like the film was kind of neutered. Like another example is that apparently at the end of the movie, both Dr. Frankenstein and Elizabeth were supposed to die in the tower along with everyone else. And that was a change that they made because of the censorship boards. And yeah, that was probably a narrative mistake, as having them all die at the end would have offered some sense of, like, tragic catharsis, showing the punishment for man's hubris. But it's so interesting because despite the fact that there were a lot of things in this movie that were restricted and censored, it also feels like this was mostly the movie that James Whale wanted to make, and a lot of people who knew James Whale confirmed that he had a lot of creative control making this movie, and I definitely feel like he indulged in some of his worst tendencies. Of course, that being said, while this film does have some issues, there's also a lot of things that I think are genuinely great about this film, and things that are also improvements. Like, for instance, how Frankenstein's monster in this movie really evolves as a character. I mean, Boris Karloff famously hated the idea of the creature speaking, like he thought that idea was stupid, but the fact that the creature becomes somewhat articulate in this movie and is able to ponder the nature of life and existence, I think adds a lot to the character, and really contributes to the ultimate ending where he chooses death over life. And this really just attests to the talent of Boris Karloff. The fact that he played this character in a way that he objected to, and still did a great job conveying the character's struggle and arc. Like, he's great in this film, and the same thing goes for Colin Clive, who reprises his role as Dr. Henry Frankenstein. While he does have a reduced screen presence in this movie compared to its predecessor, the way that Clive develops the character of Henry Frankenstein is also really interesting in this film, and how he is desperately trying to leave science behind, to leave this unnatural thing that he created behind. But other forces in life, like Dr. Pretorius, just aren't letting him go. Which I think provides a delicious kind of karma to his character. The fact that this is some sort of cosmic irony, the fact that he doesn't want to make another creature, but he's kind of forced into it. I think Valerie Hobson also does a great job in this movie playing Elizabeth, taking over the role from Mae Clarke, who apparently was too ill to reprise her role as this character. Like, generally speaking, I'm always bothered by recasts, but I can at least acknowledge when a replacement actor is doing a good job, and I think she does do a good job in this movie. But yeah, the characters and the performances in this movie are really great, and a really interesting addition to the cast in this film is Ernest Thesiger, who plays Dr. Pretorius. The character of Dr. Pretorius is incredibly interesting as an antagonist, as he feels like sort of the inverse of Dr. Waldman from the first movie. Just an eccentric scientist who is tempting Frankenstein to indulge in all of his worst impulses. Almost as if he's the devil on Frankenstein's shoulders while Dr. Waldman was the angel on his shoulders. And something I find really funny about Pretorius is the fact that he's a very inconsistent character, which would make sense because he is so eccentric. I mean, he says in this movie at different points that his only weakness is gin, but then he also goes on to say later that his only weakness is cigars. So yeah, they just really hammer home the fact that he's an unstable man who should not be trusted. And I think Ernest Thesiger does a great job playing the character, especially since, as mentioned, Pretorius was likely a stand-in for James Whale, which does not surprise me at all, as apparently Whale was an openly gay filmmaker at the time, and Dr. Pretorius is probably one of the most overtly queer-coded characters I've ever seen in a classic horror movie. I also feel like the production design in this film is amazing, just like the last film, but there's also a subtle shift with it, because while the last film heavily indulged in the German expressionist architecture that was prevalent in the 1920s, this film shifts slightly away from the expressionist design and engages more in Gothic tones in its aesthetic, which is obviously complementary to the previous film. And this Gothic aesthetic is probably best communicated by the wood set that they had made for the movie, with all the dirt and dead trees. And apparently while Whale didn't personally design that set himself, he had heavy input into what he wanted that set to look like. There's also the musical score in this movie, which is spectacular, and there's also a quality in this film that was not present in the predecessor. There was little to no musical accompaniment in the original Frankenstein. At least none that stuck out. And that's actually not too surprising because if I'm remembering properly, the first movie to actually ever feature a fully symphonic orchestral musical score was actually King Kong, which came out between this movie and its predecessor. And that groundbreaking decision in King Kong clearly had a great influence on Bride of Frankenstein, as the musical tones in this movie really stick in your head. And while the original film does not suffer at all for lacking that kind of musical accompaniment, I feel like this film greatly benefits from having musical accompaniment like that. Especially when you consider the fact that the composer for this film was actually hand-selected by James Whale. The composer's name was Franz Waxman, and Whale apparently chose him because of how impressed he was with Waxman's previous score for the movie Liliom, which was the only French film to ever be done by Fritz Lang, the Austrian filmmaker who directed Metropolis. And then, of course, there's the cinematography in this film, which was masterfully done by the famous alcoholic John Michal. John Michal had collaborated with Whale, I think, on a total of 5 films throughout both of their careers. And this is broadly considered to be Michal's best instance of photography, which I'm inclined to agree with. There's a lot of striking shots in this movie, whether it be Frankenstein's monster lifted up on a post like Christ, or the long shot of the creature walking by himself through a graveyard, only to descend into a tomb right in front of a statue of Christ on a cross. Or even just a simple shot like Beakers in a Lab. Like, John Michal might have been a drunk, but he knew how to aim a camera. And Whale knew that too. That's why he kept working with the guy until it became unsustainable. So bottom line, despite the fact that he indulged in some of his worst impulses in this movie, Whale knew how to get the right people involved in this project at the right time. That being said, there is like one major misstep in this movie, I would say, and that is the decision to bring the bride in so late in the film. Like, to be fair, The Bride of Frankenstein is not necessarily about the bride herself. Moreover, it's an extension of the first film, exploring the growing character of the creature, and the somewhat slow redemption of Dr. Frankenstein. But if you watch a movie called Bride of Frankenstein, you'd expect the bride to appear in it more, especially considering how iconic she looks. And the fact of the matter is that she only appears in like the last 5 minutes of the movie, which is just kinda lame. I mean, like in the previous movie, the creature doesn't show up until like halfway through the film, but he's an imposing presence, and he's created by the end of the first act of the film. With this movie, the whole film is just building up to the bride being created, and then she just blows up. And I feel like I would probably forgive this more if the bride had reappeared in any of these movies at any point, but she doesn't. So the fact that the bride is not a character, I feel like really hurts the film, and I feel like it's just a waste. It's a waste of a good makeup design, and it's also a waste of a good actress. Because the actress who played both the Bride of Frankenstein and Mary Shelley in this movie was Elsa Lanchester. And I think she's a good actress, and I think she does a good job in both of those roles, despite the fact that she has limited screen time. I think she does a good job as Mary Shelley, playing a very incongruent young woman who emphasizes darker elements despite her beauty. And I think she does a good job playing sort of the naive, curious bride who's brought to life. In fact, there's even a shot at the end of the movie when she hisses right before the lab blows up, and apparently that was an input from Lanchester herself. Apparently she had seen like geese or ducks hiss at each other, and she incorporated that into the movie. But yeah, Elsa Lanchester was a good actress, and I feel like it's a shame the fact that she was never used for this role again. She even said herself before her death that it was a disappointment the fact that she never got to play this character again. And I feel like it's probably the ultimate irony of this movie, the fact that she's barely in it, and yet her image from this film has become so iconic. Of course, while that does bother me a lot, I guess you could say that James Whale eventually won in the end. An ironic man who wanted nothing more than to troll traditional institutions, troll the general public, and troll the studio that he worked for, basically ended up trolling the legacy of horror films themselves. Creating one of the most iconic female characters in cinematic history, only to kill her off in 5 minutes. Now that right there, that's really feminist. But what else can be said? Bride of Frankenstein is a flawed movie. I'm not sure if it's exactly better than its predecessor, but I think it has a lot of things that it does well and a lot of things it does do better at than the previous film. And for better or worse, with some concessions, this was ultimately the film that the director wanted to make. And you know what? You can't argue with the results, because this movie is iconic. And the legacy of Frankenstein will live on through both this film and its predecessor, and we have James Whale to thank for that. So rest in peace, Mr. Whale, and sleep well knowing that we are still saying your name, and we still remember your legacy. But yeah, that was my review of Bride of Frankenstein. I hope you all enjoyed it. Please feel free to subscribe if you're feeling generous. You can also follow me on Instagram and Letterboxd if you want to hear more of my film takes. I hope all of you have a great Women's History Month and love the women in your lives. And I will see you all later.